Evening, everyone. My name is Ada Umenwaliri, and I am the Associate Director of the African Studies Center. Thank you all for joining us. Before we go into the, introducing our panelists and getting into the conversation, I just thought that this would be kind of a good icebreaker for us to get familiar with the topic at hand. So we did have 3 questions, and hopefully this would work. So the first question is, how do you move this? Which of the following do you think is the most urgent climate challenge in Africa today? Most of you said, it's everything, really. Rising temperatures, water scarcity, deforestation, loss of biodiversity. All correct answers. The second question is, what do you believe is the most effective way to promote sustainable practices in African communities? No encouraging sustainable business practices, but education and awareness, stricter environmental policies, and community-led initiatives. And the last question is, what do you believe is the most pressing global responsibility in mitigating climate change impact in Africa? And it's interesting, encouraging sustainable investments in African initiatives, but no sustainable business practices. Yeah, thank you all for participating. I'm disappointed that we can all record your responses. So let's go to some of the, what the data is showing us and research is showing. So the first question, which of the following do you think is the most urgent climate challenge in Africa? It's all of the above and even more. And this is some of what I found on the internet. For instance, the Central African Republic to Somalia and Sudan, which are all considered fragile states, suffer more from floods, droughts, storms, and other climate-related shocks than other countries when they have contributed the least to climate change. And poll 2, again, what do you believe is the most effective way to promote sustainable practices? There's a lot of conversation around financing, capacity development, technology transfer, and policy enforcement and introductions. And the last poll is around global responsibility in mitigating climate change impacts in Africa. And this is a very instructive quote. It says, and I read, "While Africa has contributed negligibly, it's that time of the day, to the changing climate with just about 2 to 3% of global emissions, it stands out disproportionately as the most vulnerable region in the world. This vulnerability is driven by the prevailing low levels of socioeconomic growth in the continent. So while climate change is global and the poor are more vulnerable to its effects, this is because they lack the resources to afford goods and services they need to buffer themselves and recover from the worst of the changing climate effects. This is the case of Africa." So with that, I would ask my panelists to please come back on the stage, and we would also introduce our panelist who's joining us from Accra. Are you in Accra, Dr. Owusu?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for joining us.
That's good.
So climate change is a pressing global concern with significant implications. Our conversation this evening would aim to navigate the complexities of climate change in the region. Hopefully, we can have a conversation that would offer some clarity, because we all know it's a complicated issue, on the delicate balance between development and environmental preservation. So I'll introduce our panelists, and we're honored to have the right expertise in the room. We have development economics, environmental science, and international affairs. And I'll start with Dr. Owusu. Dr. Owusu is a professor and the director of the Center of Climate Change and Sustainability Studies at the University of Ghana. He is also the immediate past head of the Department of Geography and Resource Development at the same university. He holds a BA in Geography and Resource Development from the University of Ghana, an MS and PhD in Geography from the University of Florida. His areas of teaching and research interests are climatology, climate variability, and change water resource development and smallholder adaptation to climate change. Dr. Owusu has worked on many international research projects that have contributed knowledge towards improving smallholder farmers' resilience to the negative impact of climate change on agriculture and rural development. He was the foundation coordinator of the University of Ghana's Climate Change and Sustainable Development Program from 2013 to 2016. He also contributed to Ghana's third and fourth national communication to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Owusu.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Ambassador Bisa Williams. She is a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs. Ambassador Williams is also recently named as not Distinguished Visiting Professor of the Practice at UNC-Chapel Hill's program in Peace, War, and Defense. Since 2018, Ambassador Williams had led the Carter Center's efforts as independent observer of implementation of the peace agreement in Mali, West Africa. Her diplomatic career began in the US Department of State, where she was a career member of the US Foreign Service, serving in Africa, Central America, Europe, and the US, including at the US mission to the United Nations and the National Security Council of the White House. As acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Bisa led the US delegation to talks in Havana, Cuba, ending a 7-year hiatus on high-level direct discussions. Her accomplishments were recognized in the book, Back Channel to Cuba. Appointed by President Barack Obama in 2010, Bisa served for 3 years as ambassador to Niger and subsequently earned the distinction of being the first Department of State officer ever to be awarded the Agency Seal Medal from the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency for her exceptional contributions to US national security. Returning to Washington as Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Williams retired from the Foreign Service in 2015. She co-founded Williams Strategy Advisors, LLC, a problem-solving business and foreign affairs advisory with her brother, Paul T. Williams, Jr. in 2016. She chairs the Board of Health and Development International, an NGO whose groundbreaking study was recognized in January 2013 by Lancet Global Health Journal and Harvard's Maternal Health Task Force. Ambassador Williams is a trustee of World Learning, and she's also on the board of African Agriculture, an American company dedicated to African agricultural production and food security. She speaks French, Spanish, Portuguese, and holds a Master of Science degree in National Security Strategy from the National War College of the National Defense University, a Master's of Arts degree in Comparative Literature from UCLA, and received her BA cum laude from Yale. Nice to have you, Ambassador Williams. Give me the whole thing. Yeah.
I have to go after that.
So our third and not last panelist is Dr. Aaron Salzberg, who also has an impressive resume, by the way. Dr. Salzberg serves as the director of the Water Institute and the Don and Jennifer Holsworth Distinguished Professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Engineering in the Gilling School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to joining UNC, Aaron served as a special coordinator for water resources in the US Department of State, where he managed the development and implementation of US foreign policy on drinking water and sanitation, water resources management, and transboundary water issues. He was the first person to hold this title. In his role, Aaron led the development of the first US government global water strategy and represented the United States in many multilateral policy-making processes. He also led the Department of State's engagement on transboundary water issues in many regions throughout the world where water is or may become a source of tension or conflict. Dr. Salzberg has a PhD in genetic toxicology, a Master of Science degree in technology and policy from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a Master of Science degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Maryland. He is the recipient of numerous awards and distinctions and currently holds appointments as a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a member of the World Meteorological Organization's Scientific Research Board. Thank you, panelists. And at this point, I think I'm going to take a seat so we can have this conversation. So it is clear that we have the right expertise in the room as we explore this topic of climate change. We're going to talk on global climate challenges, sustainable development, and international cooperation. And I'm going to start the first question and address it to Dr. Owusu. The question is, what are the key economic challenges that African nations face in addressing climate change while trying to pursue sustainable development?
Thank you very much. The issue of financing when it comes to climate change and sustainable development in Africa is one of availability of funds to tackle the challenges as identified. And the point is the economies are not doing that well. So to begin with, there is underdevelopment. Financing of government programs are not well oiled. A lot of governments in Africa finance part of their budget through donor support, and that is not guaranteed that you always have that. So in terms of financial challenges, it is the fact that the African economies are not growing to be able to tackle the day-to-day bread and butter issues, to be able to then engineer out of some of the challenges that are confronting the various governments on the continent. So I will sum up by saying that the levels of poverty and the lack of growth within the economies is a major challenge to tackling climate change on the continent.
Thank you for highlighting some of these economic challenges. I'm going to turn to Dr. Salzberg. How does climate change impact water resources in Africa, and what does this mean for communities and their development?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And in many respects, the climate changes we're going to see in Africa are the same that we're going to see almost everywhere else. And again, you saw this in the quotes that opened this up. I think the real challenge is that many countries and communities in Africa will lack the capacity to respond effectively, and that makes them especially vulnerable. And I think that's going to be particularly true for marginalized populations. And that's what I think makes this issue pretty critical for the continent. In terms of how climate change is going to impact water, I think you guys got a pretty good sense of this, right? The first is rainfall patterns are going to shift. I think the general consensus is that wet areas are going to get wetter, dry areas are going to get a little bit drier. The biggest challenge may be the increasing variability of precipitation events. In other words, rainfall events are likely to become shorter, more concentrated, and more intense. And the periods between rainfall events are likely to become longer. And so you'll have longer dry periods, and you'll have shorter, more intense wet periods. And that makes it really challenging issue to manage, right? Because you can imagine if you get all your water in one day that you usually would get over a course of a month, how do you capture, store, have that water available then for all the economic purposes that you're thinking about later on? So that variability is incredibly challenging, and the lack of capacity that many of these countries have to do hydrometeorological monitoring and forecasting makes it particularly challenging for these countries to effectively plan and respond to these types of challenges. The other is that, some of these connections between climate and water are really pernicious and not really well understood. I'll give you an example. If you have a prolonged dry period and lack vegetative cover, the soil becomes more acidic. And what happens is when it rains, that water then percolating down into the groundwater is more acidic. And that more acidic groundwater, when it's pumped up into these pump systems, is more corrosive to the pump systems. And what we see is that in many areas that are subject to these more acidic land areas, the pumps fail at a much higher frequency. And instead of lasting 10 years, they last 2 years. It's also part of the increases corrosion in these systems. And I would argue that probably about 80% of the systems within Africa are built from components and parts that contain lead. And these corrosive processes will then introduce these contaminants into drinking water. So nobody would have thought about that kind of a connection, let's say, between climate and drinking water. But those are the kinds of pernicious effects that we might start to see that we hadn't thought about. Increasing temperature, you saw this, increasing temperature and poor water management is going to increase the habitat for many vector-borne diseases. And this is going to be true in Africa, whether it's dengue fever, malaria, yellow fever. These are all mosquito-borne things, and create the way you manage water can play a huge role in those health impacts. Surface temperatures are also going to rise. We often talk about this 2 degrees Celsius, but I think in some areas, we can see as much as a 5 to 7 degrees Celsius increase, and surface temperatures are going to get much, much hotter. And that has a huge impact then on the amount of water that you need to grow crops, the amount of water we need as people to drink, the evapotranspiration and evaporation from water sources that are on the surface. And all these things are going to challenge then how we manage water. We may be able to balance some of those impacts through better irrigation practices, drought and heat tolerant crops and things like that. But this is going to require significant capacity and investment. And it's going to be particularly challenging for Africa, where roughly 65% of the population are subsistence farmers. And so they live off the land, and they don't have that kind of capacity to adapt and respond. Climate change is also going to likely increase the transmission of pathogens into drinking water. The pathogens don't really fly around, but you can imagine during extreme flooding events. In fact, I have a graduate student here who's working on this very issue. If you have sanitation infrastructure that's not built in sound, these rain events are going to carry those pathogens from that leaky infrastructure into the environment. And you see this in peri-urban and informal settlements and communities where they've got these large sewers and large drains. Those things overflow often in these extreme rain events, and you end up with pathogens being spread throughout the entire community. Again, another kind of strange connection back to climate. The rise in temperature is going to increase the demand for energy for cooling, energy for other purposes. And of course, water is important for almost all sources of energy production, but particularly for hydropower. And that's a major component of many African countries right now, power production capability. And so how does that then factor into our ability to manage our water resources? This inability, I think, to sustain locally livelihoods is going to be a contributing factor to migration. It can increase tensions locally between farmers and pastoralists, and perhaps even regionally between countries. And I want to be careful here because the evidence here is weak, right? And the connections here are hard to make. And the drivers of migration and conflict are very complex. And certainly it's very difficult to attribute them proximally to things like climate change. But there's no question that the lack of availability of water resources and the ability to manage these things soundly is going to stress many of these systems, and it's going to certainly be a factor in these types of problems that we're seeing. In general, cooperation is more common than conflict, and so we may see that as water resources become more scarce and some of these climate impacts become more pronounced, countries start working together in new and creative ways. And so it's not all a negative here. I do think we have to worry about the risks to tension and cooperation, but at the same time, there's opportunities, I think, to build trust, build cooperation, build institutions that can work across ministries, across political boundaries, in order to solve some of these complex problems. So maybe those are some of the challenges.
Thank you for your insightful contribution. Quite comprehensive. Yeah, very comprehensive, Dr. Salzberg. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Williams. So from a diplomatic perspective, what obstacles do you think there will be, if any, in achieving consensus in mitigating climate change in Africa?
Well, thank you. And thank you all for coming and for inviting me to participate in this panel. I participated in some of the early negotiations for the climate change agreement. And while we have reached a level of consensus, we have we're getting ready to go to COP27, no? 28, Conference of Parties for the Climate Change Agreement. My experience as a diplomat working on this was that there's actually a tension. There's a philosophical tension and there's a financial tension that has been alluded to. And I think that part of the philosophical tension is that, okay, climate change, very often for developed world, developed countries, let's say, it's a now problem. Sea levels are rising. How much more time can we on planet Earth deal with the relatively rapid change that we're seeing? So it's a now problem and people need to prioritize it so we can look to a future. Often in developing countries, they're saying, well, it might be your now problem, but what about what has happened to us and how your lifestyles have contributed to our not being able to be where you are, our not being able to catch up to where you are. So in a way, it's a sort of like, it was a then problem and we've got other priorities. Or we want you to pay attention. We want you developing countries. I don't want to talk about different worlds. There's one, that's the whole thing. One planet for all the earthlings. So there's one world and we have different kinds of things happening on it. So people in the developing countries are saying, well, wait a second. You are saying not to use our coal, not to touch our forests, and to buy your newly developed seeds because the ones we've been using for millennia all of a sudden aren't working anymore because of issues that you have created. But we need to be competent. We need help in compensating for this. Now I can't feed my country. I can't feed my subsistence family. Cannot eat. And how do you address that? So I think that in the diplomatic world, what we were trying to say, well, okay, well, we have to create norms. We're going to have a convention. We're going to try to get together and see what we can agree on. So then then the issue becomes, well, we don't want to, there's no point in casting blame. What we all have to do is take responsibility. And diplomatically, that's hard to do. It's hard to do when the wealth is not evenly distributed, because a lot of the answers that governments talk about in formal international organizations comes down to money. Who's going to contribute how much money to solving this problem? So that leaves those countries that don't have a lot of cash in their banks with less influence. That's one thing. So that's part of the dynamic of the tension. But if your question is, so, okay, well, how do we solve that? It's very important to keep these meetings going. What I think is now being introduced more, but is not completely successful. Governments can only do so much, and they can set up aspirational goals. We can have conventions. We can have we can have criteria that we consider that we would like to become norms, or that we would like governments to go home and implement. But in most of the developing and in developed countries, the emitters of the CO2, that's not coming from governments per se, that's really coming from private sector. And the linkage between what a government wants to happen and how much control they have over a Pittsburgh steel company or a car manufacturer or a coal mine in Kentucky. Those are different issues. And that synergy between, okay, well, how do we get the private sector, those private emitters, the polluters, if you will, or let's talk about depletion of fish stocks and the warming of waters and how fish are moving to different parts of the planet, and therefore, but the humans who are depending on them all of a sudden don't have their staple. And that's because the waters are warming, and they're warming because of what somebody's doing in another part of the planet. How to implement the policy in a way that affects private sector is something that we have not figured out how to regulate, how to control. And I think that's an obstacle. But in the United States, we set up aspirational goals, and we ask for voluntary compliance. We have campaigns. We have recycling campaigns. We have, we have all kinds of be conscious of conservation campaigns. In an information-based society, maybe that can work, where everybody can communicate, they can all mostly read and write and talk to each other. In countries where maybe you have 3 or 4 different languages that are the norm, where you don't have the same interconnectivity among peoples, and you have not explained why what happens in your village or in your community is important for the rest, or why you should even care about what central government is telling you 1,000 miles away in your same country. We haven't looked at that dynamic. So I think those are some of the obstacles.
Dr. Salzberg, with your background in managing U.S. foreign policy around water resources, can you also speak to how international collaboration can be enhanced to address transboundary water issues in Africa? And before you go into it, can you also give, for the benefit of everyone here, what are transboundary water issues?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's different ways to think about it. I actually try to avoid using the word transboundary because that's a politically loaded term. But the idea is that you have rivers or aquifers, right? Underground rivers and lakes that are utilized by 2 or more countries. And so there are shared water resources. Some of them form boundaries, some of them cut across boundaries. It gets a little bit complicated. So for me, it's about shared water resources and how we manage these shared water resources. And in fact, I'm kind of 2 minds of this. So on one side, I just walk away. Don't get involved. Leave it to the parties. They'll figure this out eventually, and that's the best thing you can do. And on the other side, I can't do that, right? Because these can be really not only challenging problems, but very serious problems. And so in our previous jobs where we cared about protecting U.S. national interests, there's a reason why the United States would want to get involved in some of these issues in order to protect our national security interests. And so there are reasons why we might want to do this. And look, these are really challenging issues on transboundary water. Many of these problems share very similar characteristics. There's often very legitimate competing interests, right? And by that, I mean, if you look at, let's use the Nile example, something you and I both worked on, you've got Ethiopia's need to use its water to generate power for a population where only 50% of their population has access to power. And that's a very legitimate need and a very legitimate use. And then you've got Egypt, who's wholly dependent on water coming to its country from this river, from an external transboundary source. And they are one of the most arid, water insecure countries in the world. Very legitimate competing interests. And that's often the case in transboundary water. And that's a real challenge to manage. Right. Well, I haven't mentioned the conflict there yet. And we can come back to that one. I can spend hours on that, but we can talk about lots of places. A lot of these basins, there's also a lack of sound data. The fact is we just don't have enough data to understand what's going on. And a lot of these disputes are dominated by myths. I would travel around the world. Every downstream country will complain that the upstream country is stealing their water, is poisoning their water, is doing something to their water. And you need facts to be able to actually begin to have a rational conversation around these types of things. So the lack of data, legitimate competing interests, the lack of data, and that's even exacerbated by, of course, climate change, where you've got two problems. One, the systems are changing rapidly. And so what you have today is not what you're going to have 5 years from now, and is certainly not what you're going to have 50 years from now. So imagine trying to negotiate a treaty today when you don't know what your needs and resources available are going to be 50 years from now. No country wants to agree to anything that might prejudice its future opportunities. And that's what we're asking countries to do in a lot of these cases. Really, really challenging. And there's also a high degree of uncertainty. And so how you even talk about the numbers associated with this becomes really challenging, because we're just not sure what the numbers really are. And that creates space for misinformation, disinformation to come in and shape that dialogue. And that's a real problem. There are often very significant asymmetries in power and capacity. And so how do you reconcile these power imbalances in these types of cases? In many cases, there's a lack of history of cooperation. Look, by and large, if countries work together to solve problems, leave them alone. They will figure this out. But in many places, they don't have these relationships. They don't have these institutional mechanisms for cooperation and how they talk to each other. So this idea of lacking those communication skills is important. I'm also concerned about, and I think this touches on some of what Bisa was mentioning, these global trends towards unilateralism and authoritarianism, a lack of respect for international norms, are making it very, very difficult to get parties to the table and to think about the global good. I mean, the big motivating factor in transboundary water is that we're going to have to manage the resources at the basin level to optimize the benefits among all the different parties. And that's a driver towards cooperation. But if countries go at this saying, look, I want to win, and I want to maximize my gains, and that is the trend that we're heading towards, then I fear that that's going to undermine this. Then, okay, we need, it's the difference between the rising tide lifts all boats, and no, we need to win, and we need to win at all costs and advance our interests. How do you deal with these types of issues? You have to invest in capacity building, and not just how you manage water, but the process skills. I mean, this is something that, we're biased, I think. We live in process, but the idea is, how do you help countries talk to each other and manage a process that allows them to get to the right answer? And look, let's be very clear. Africa has championed the motto of learn by doing. Our coming in and saying, oh, here's what we did and you should do this is not the right, it doesn't get you the right solution. I think the gift that we as diplomats have often brought to the table is that we can manage a process that allows the parties to get to the right answer for them. And I think that's an important skill set and capacity we need to build. We need to invest. We need to invest in data. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to provide investments that will incentivize cooperative outcomes. I think those things are important. And I think we should provide direct support to facilitate, mediate, or arbitrate when we're asked to do that, and when we can provide that support. But again, we need to tread very, very lightly there. Any solution that you come up with really has to be owned by the countries themselves, or it's not sustainable. And so how you go in as a diplomat or as a partner to support countries in that effort is really important, and doing it with the right level of humility is critical.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Owusu. Given your extensive work with smallholder farmers and also smallholder adaptation to climate change, how do you envision the role of local communities and grassroots initiatives in fostering the resilience and sustainable development in the communities? And also, I wondered if you wanted to also share some insight, like respond to the question that Dr. Salzberg also just responded to around, permit me to use the word one more time,
Shared waters.
Okay.
Yeah, so two questions essentially.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to repeat the question, the transboundary question, if you want.
Sure. Let me take the first part, and then when I finish, you repeat it, and then I take a go at it.
Okay.
So the issue of local level initiatives and what is happening at the local level is very, very important. I listened to the ambassador present the politics about climate change and all that. That politics get done at the national level. So when you talk about loss and damage and compensating for, compensating for loss and damage, it is a talk at the corps. But when you get to the local level, people are thinking about survival. I also want to take the opportunity to say that when we talk about smallholder farmers, it is a scale of operation. This idea of subsistence farming, in the case of Ghana, it doesn't exist anymore. Nobody goes into agriculture now just to feed themselves and their family and sell the surplus. Then the few people in Ghana that are left in agriculture are still operating on the small scale, a hectare to 2 hectares. That is why we call them smallholder farmers. But their first objective is to make profit from the farming they are doing. So when you don't coordinate with the farmers, they try anything that will work. So if food crops are not working and tree crops that are commercial crops like cashew is working better, they will move to that. If they move to that, what is the implication for household food security and then national food security? The dynamics of agriculture in Africa, and sometimes I want to segregate because the countries are different, but for most part, the government doesn't subsidize much of what the farmers do. They are on their own. So if you don't work with the farmers to come out with innovations that will work for them, and you take it at the higher level and come out with genetically improved varieties that can withstand drought. The question in the loophole is, do you expect the farmer, and is the farmer interested in buying seeds from a seeds market every season to plant? It is not like their seeds don't work. The argument is that it doesn't work as well or as good as the improved varieties may do. But if you give the farmer the improved variety, will you give him all the agronomic things that should go with it for him to get there? So sometimes the farmers are even better off using the varieties they know because they can manage them well. Some of these improved varieties have time scale attached to it. You have to spray 3 weeks, you have to water, you have to do this, you have to do that. And most of these smallholder farmers don't have access to that. So what I would say is that the opportunities for the farmers that are working and working well are the ones that are co-produced, so that the farmers understand and also make input. They are smart, they know what is happening. They may not have all the resources, but they know what works for them. One thing I have also seen with the farmers, they are not in just to feed their families. So farmers are not interested in getting support for things that will just work at the farmer household level. Like going to cassava is quite drought tolerant. You will get some food even if there is drought. The question the farmers are asking is, that is fine, but who will buy the cassava? What is the price of gari when cassava is processed into food? So they would rather, in the places I'm doing research now, go for cashew, which then may be good in terms of the net market option, but then in years that there are challenges, then that can also hurt food security. So I think that any adaptation strategy that will work and work best will be the one that is co-developed by the farmers in the rural areas with extension service and institutional support. Then that can yield some positive results, and then you can upscale that. Either than that, there is, as it is now, there is a disconnect at the national political level, feeding into the COP system, negotiations, and trying to talk what is important for the nation. But is that what the local people want? So there is that disconnect that has to also be part of the discussion.
Thank you. I think the second question, which maybe I would rephrase it, I was curious to hear your reaction to the question about trans-boundary water issues and conflicts, and specifically maybe like in the course of your research, I think I'm curious to see like what are you finding when it comes to water and how and how it's becoming scarce, and are you seeing two questions, like how is it affecting yield, but then also how is it also becoming, is there conflicts, are you seeing more conflict in the areas that you're researching?
In the areas that I'm researching, the conflict, there is a precursor. It could lead to conflict, but people are managing well. So in terms of transboundary, Ghana has a situation like that on the Volta Basin, having to share with both Burkina Faso and the Ivory Coast. The other countries like Benin, Togo, all are part, and even some portions of Niger. But it has been some informal contacts with Ghana and Burkina Faso trying to avoid conflict and to manage their resources well. So Ghana, as my colleague panelist said, in terms of need, Burkina Faso said they needed water to do electricity. So they put a dam on the Volta upstream to Ghana. And Ghana had some opposition to that, but it didn't come to conflict. Burkina has built the dam, and now one of the challenges that are affecting rural people is that occasionally, and it's quite often, Burkina Faso has to spill the dam. It's called the Bagri Dam, because to protect the dam. And then it leads to flooding in northern Ghana. So I talk about the disconnect. So Burkina Faso will be ready to spill the dam. They will issue a signal from Ouagadougou, and it will pass the local people and come to Accra. And then they have to send it back down to the people. Sometimes it doesn't get through, and then we have occasional flooding that leads to loss of property and probably life, which is an issue. But it is an issue, hasn't led to conflict, but it has to be managed. But I know that the World Bank, for instance, has tried in the past to really put some help the countries involved to put up a protocol as to how best to use the water. But it's a thorny issue now with climate change. The international community tried to support Egypt's position, for instance, and say Ethiopia shouldn't put a dam upstream that could hurt Egypt. Then Ethiopia said, we will do it ourselves. We will use our own national resources, and they are building a huge dam, which is a source of conflict between the countries, which hasn't openly led to war directly, but there are a lot of challenges. So with climate change becoming an added stress on increasing population demand for water, I think dialogue, which in many cases is working, should be deepened. Either than that, there is that possibility that water scarcity and transboundary water issues could lead to conflict in many African sub-regions.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to you, Ambassador Williams, just to get your insights on strategic partnerships between African nations and international organizations. What are your thoughts on how they can be leveraged to build more inclusive and homegrown, just piggybacking on his comments about homegrown solutions?
I must say, Dr. Owusu's, I love that explanation, and those examples are really good. And the idea of homegrown solutions, generally, those are the ones that we find that work best. And some of the homegrown solutions don't rely on new modern technology, new green technology at all. Some of traditional practices, particularly when it comes to how to manage soils and how to protect seeds and plant, and find water. They call it water farming or something, water harvesting. Are remedies or are practices that have been practiced in traditional cultures for generations. But at any rate, so your question to me is how do we get to international cooperation, or what are some of the mechanisms? I don't think that we've been great at it, but there are efforts. The World Bank put together, for example, the biggest example of that is the GEF, the Global Environmental Fund, which was to be which is a fund that incentivizes green technology and sustainable practices, whether in farming or water conservation or reducing pollutants and all the rest. I think that we had held out the hope that there would be greater South-South, so to speak, cooperation, that countries like Brazil, maybe South Africa, that have more resources, that have a little bit more experience and have been working on things, would in particular really engage in Africa and find ways to collaborate. And I don't think that has come to fruition in a way that was anticipated. And maybe that was wishful thinking, for example, on the US, I used to be in the US government, on the US part, well, let the Brazilians do it, let somebody else handle it. It was a way of passing the buck, sort of, and denying our own responsibility and ability to help. So, so there are, though, like I said, your traditional international institutions, the African Development Bank has environmental programs, World Bank has some, and what we are seeing, there are a few courageous and just smart companies, multinational companies, and just international companies that that have decided to work with the communities and partner in a way that says, like, for example, Procter & Gamble has a factory or whatever, production in Nigeria, but it also then invests in environmentally sound or community-based solutions for whatever they have, their communities they're working with have identified as problems. So I don't think that there is a standardized collective way of finding these kinds of mechanisms. But there's another industrial agricultural company working in Africa that does public-private partnerships with traditional communities that are trustees of the land, and with the government, and then the private company that is trying to make use of the land for agricultural purposes. I had thought of something else, but now I can't think of it. Oh, but I have a water question. Can I answer it? Yes. We talk about this. It's a water and a data question. I think your point about using data to our advantage is really crucial. I'm not a data specialist, but I was talking with people in Niger, and they said, all this time in Niger, everybody says it's one of the hottest places on the planet. It's part of the Sahel. More than half of it is desert. The rest is like savanna. However, all this time, in Niger, they have a tendency to talk about fossilized water, to talk about aquifers. Mm-hmm. But they also say now that they realize all this time we thought we didn't have any water. We've been walking on water all this time. It's very far below the surface. So my question is there data? Do we have real knowledge about how much water could be available that might be under these very, very arid places that we don't know how to tap into, or that perhaps we shouldn't tap into? Is there information about that?
Yeah, there is. And it's better and worse in some places, but actually we've done a pretty good job of mapping most of the aquifers now, understanding the question is what their yield is and whether or not they can be replenished. And if it's, if it's a fossil, remember a fossil aquifer, even for Egypt, for example, who sits over the Danubian aquifer, which is a very big fossil aquifer. It's like having a bank account, but you can withdraw, but you can't put anything in. And so the question is about sustainability. And can you use that to get you to a better place? And so, okay, for the next 50 years, we're going to use this aquifer to help us support a transition to a more sustainable thing, knowing that that water is going to be gone in 50 years, then you can do that. But to get renewable resources at that level, we're really struggling in many places around the world. We're extracting the water out faster than it's being replenished in groundwater, and that's a challenge. There was actually something that came out literally this week about water very deep underground as part of, closer to the Earth's mantle. And that's kind of intriguing, but then you have to worry about the quality of that water, the usability of all this type of stuff. I think we're ways off from that. I mean, look, the reality is there's enough water in the world for us to do everything we need to do. We just don't manage water very well. And particularly in agrarian economies, we don't manage water very well. Just to add, because I wanted to push a question back to you, because you mentioned this idea of norms and developing normative processes and stuff like that. And I think there is, tying back to the other point about let's say Ethiopia in this case was self-financing their dam. I think the way infrastructure is financed has changed radically over the last 30 years. It used to be everybody would go to the African Development Bank or the World Bank, where we've negotiated social and environmental standards around this type of infrastructure. And now countries can bypass all of that. Venture capitalists are financing dams, and they can bypass all these types of safeguards that we've worked so hard to put in. And so I think there's a real question about how we make those international norms. Sorry, did I remind you?
Yeah, that reminded me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was going to say one of the other mechanisms, for example, in the United States has the Millennium Challenge Corporation.
Right.
So an MCC grant would grants an enormous, for the United States standards, an enormous amount of money, $500 million, $450 million, $350 million for, in many instances, let's say, an agricultural / conservation project, or even a water project, energy project that will be sustainable. Let's just put it as sustainable. However, attached to that grant, number one, you can only get the grant if you meet certain criteria, and the criteria, yes, they have to do with what are the actual environmental conditions, but they also have to do with what are the political conditions, what are the human rights conditions, what are your gender parity conditions. And so that complicates it for addressing what one country might say, well, my need is access to water. But I have some other things in my country that are not happening so well, but really my need is access to water. But that is a mechanism that's useful.
It's a very contentious funding source because of like the barriers that you mentioned. When people have like really pressing, urgent issues and problems to solve, but there is all of the requirements that would probably take them 10 years to solve. So it's, but there's some countries that have been able to fulfill the requirements.
Yeah, lots.
And have been able to access the Millennium Challenge funds.
Well, but it's also a little bit different, right? In some respects, the MCC is budgetary support.
It is.
Right.
Yes.
So we're giving support to countries that have demonstrated that they have the capacity to manage these resources and to reach decisions in a very broad, consultative, stakeholder-based, proper way. And if they do that, then we, and not we, let's say as the United States government, but we as the United States through Congress and the way we think about things, we as the American public will then feel more comfortable giving them those resources if they meet those requirements. And that is a challenge, right? And it's a challenge that people in the United States government have to manage that dynamic all the time between this tension. And we heard this come up a little before, where if you notice the word compensating came up, right? And this is a big issue within the COP talks. The United States will never, ever use that word within the context of these COP discussions. The United States is not going to compensate any country for climate damages. That's not the way we look at it right now. But there's a real disconnect between the way the United States is speaking and what other countries are hearing and how that policy debate is playing out. Because there is a real legitimate discussion to be had around this idea of either reparations for climate, which is a different issue, than helping to support climates adapt and minimize the damages that might result from climate change, which is where the United States is when it comes to talking about compensation, so to speak.
And that's also where the whole notion of environmental justice
Exactly.
comes in. But again, I think obviously I think the debate is very legitimate, because earlier it was said, you know, we can offer some good practices. This is how we're solving this problem. But we don't look at, well, we don't say, so in that instance, we're saying, here, we have something to teach. This is what we did and it works. But, you know, we also used coal and that really worked for us. We also, you know, polluted incredibly much. That really worked for us. I mean, you know, it really worked for us. But we're telling everybody, no, 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 you shouldn't use your coal. No, 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 you can't cut down your trees. No, 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 you can't do this. So I think, so there,
Attention, is it disingenuous?
it's not disingenuous because it's very plain. Disingenuous, we're not trying to hide it. We're telling them,
that's
no,
true.
don't use your coal.
Okay.
It is, well, it depends on your spectrum. If you want to have a moral spectrum, it's unfair. If you want to have less moralistic, more diplomatic, let's say, you can just say they're what do you call that? It's asymmetrical. It's just asymmetrical. And in the other example that you gave, we're really talking about two different kinds of things, because if the United States, we have an argument that says we American taxpayers don't want to waste their money. We will give you this money if we think that your government can handle it. Will you manage it properly? Is there going to be the right kind of accountability? Are you going to do it in a certain amount of time frame? In the meantime, the demandeur, the country that's in need and maybe asking for the grant or for the money, they have a material problem. It's got nothing to do with a checking account. It's got nothing to do with how good their accountants are or what schools they went to. Nothing to do with that. So you are asking them to respond to a certain set of questions on a different problem. And you're not responding to the immediate problem. And that has to do with, again, what is our relationship? Again in my head, because it's a question I'm always asking myself. As on this one planet, we Earthlings, what is the relationship that we have to each other? How much responsibility do we have for other Earthlings that just happened? You know, is it your fault that you weren't born in Pittsburgh? So therefore, I don't care about you. I don't have a responsibility to help you.
What responsibilities do I have to provide your services if you move to the desert in Arizona? Am I responsible for ensuring that you've got the water that you want there?
Yeah.
These are really challenging questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated topic.
And it even hits here.
Yeah, right.
Transboundary water sources.
Yeah, it is also prevalent here in the US. I want to continue asking you all questions, but I feel like we might have Gordon's questions.
Oh, forgot about
and if
Because otherwise we'll go on.
that.
yeah,
I wanted to add just a little on the water resource development, infrastructure development in Africa in particular.
Yes, okay.
Okay, so the idea is that when the West has stayed engaged, yes, the way of doing business has changed, but the safeguards don't go away. So for a long time, because of environmental concerns, no new dams were being financed by the OECD or the World Bank. But then China came to town, and they came with both ability to do the dam and also ability to finance it. So a whole new dams were opening up in Africa, and Ghana did about 1 or 2. And then there was this backlash and a lot of alarm from the West that, oh, they are doing dams, there are no environmental safeguard. But in countries like Ghana, where the US government has stayed engaged and Ghana has gone through several rounds of the Millennium Challenge program, the African countries don't want to lose the West as their developing partners. So they try to keep the guidelines and the better ways of doing something. So even though China did not require the Ghanaian government to do an environmental assessment, ESIA, environmental and social impact assessment, Ghana
Mhm.
did it for the Bui Dam, and it contracted a French company to do it. So yes, the game has changed because some of the countries like Ethiopia are doing it by themselves. Others are getting support from China. But if the country still sees the West as a developing partner, they then try to put in the proper safeguard to make sure that they will qualify for other programs that they enjoy from the West. So this is the new reality on the continent as well.
That's true. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Important
For that
addition.
contribution. So if you have, are there any audience questions? We have microphones on both ends of the end or beginning of the aisle. Did I? That's okay.
Maybe while you guys are thinking, I mean, are we a good development partner?
Complicated topic.
Are we?
Is the United States a good development partner?
I think it depends on the country that you ask. I think we mean well, don't get me wrong. But I do think that we drive a hard bargain. I think we drive a hard bargain, and we are a little stingy with our assistance, and that we favor those countries that we're used to. Yeah, so I have a critique post service, post 31 years of advocacy. Yeah.
Yeah, I know the intelligence community came out with an NIE on climate change recently, and they identified African countries that were priorities, but they were priorities because they were U.S. strategic interests, not priorities because of the vulnerabilities that those countries may have faced.
Right.
And that and the budgets are at the mission level are in my view really small, and I'm not sure they're very supportive of infrastructure. Certainly not major infrastructure investments. We're not really built for that as the U.S. government. I think it's hard
Marshall
for us.
Plan, but anyway.
But I agree. Can we do a Marshall Plan for Africa right now?
Well, Africa's huge.
Talk about a Marshall Plan. What is a Marshall Plan?
Oh, this is UNC. Everybody knows what Marshall Plan is. I mean, don't they?
But for the benefit of the students.
Was that a hand raised? Did you want to talk about it? Oh, I thought you raised it. Sorry, you did. Oh, okay.
No pressure.
In a sentence, the Marshall Plan was a concerted effort by the victors of World War II to rebuild the Europe that they had destroyed, and also some of that money went to Japan, and it took a lot of money, took a lot of coordination, and then the Bretton Woods institutions. It became the motor of the current financial order that our international relations, upon which our international relations are based now. But a lot of Europe needed to be. I'm not trying to say we didn't need it. It needed to be built up. It was, like I said, it was the war to end all wars until the next one. But so Europe needed to be rebuilt, and they relied upon their friends to do it.
And Dr. Salzberg's point is create a Marshall Plan for climate change.
Well, my big concern, of course, is that we certainly, I worry about the U.S. government, but I think we as a global community, we're not built to respond to some of these challenges that we're now currently facing. And I think we've lost, I think, this idea of how multilateral approaches can work and to solve some of these problems. And I think we're losing that skill set. And I'm not sure everybody believes in it anymore. And that's presenting some real challenges to how we work going forward.
Nobody believes in what anymore?
I think this, again, the idea that a rising tide will lift all boats, that we should be investing in other countries, that we should be bringing them up, that we should be self-sacrificing, so to speak, because at the end of the day, that's, you're right. Every international negotiation is about a transfer of resources. And even at an individual level, when we think about this, are we willing to give up our jobs, our money that, we get paid because we think we went to a good school, we worked really hard, so maybe I deserve the money I've got and I can provide security for my family. Am I willing to give that up to increase the security of my next door neighbors? And that's a challenge, not just for us every day and where we live, but globally.
Mhm.
And I think it's a real hard question. And I balance that against the question of how much do you need to retire? Because, how do you guarantee then the assurances for countries that are thinking about their futures in these type of negotiated frameworks so that they feel comfortable in a very uncertain future?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, yes, all those are important questions. But what's interesting about this generation that we're speaking to is that they have a different kind of global perspective, and they are they're more connected, and I get the impression they seem to have more compassion for their fellow humans. So that for me is a great positive sign. Oh shoot, I forgot it. But I was going to say, so before we condemn ourselves, I want to say that I get the distinct impression that this generation does care about what's going on somewhere else. And the whole notion of, are we going to be totally transactional is what you're saying about everything. I think, a lot depends on leadership. And if we get the right kinds of leaders coming out, then attitudes can change. So.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah.
Dr. Owusu, I wanted to ask you about. No, go ahead.
You want to do questions?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you mind coming to the mic, because we are recording this and we want to make sure your excellent question right up here on the side here.
Since the ambassador referenced, I think, the youth in the room, and I'm no longer probably part of that population, but
For me,
I think what we're seeing, I would argue, is sort of a kind of discontent between and dissent from like younger populations around the world with their governments, and this idea of defending the nation state and national security interests at a time where we see with climate change that we're sort of have to think beyond this idea of the nation state and think across humanity, or earthlings, as you're saying. So I think that's one of my questions is to the diplomats, like, who obviously you have to argue, or formally for the interests of your nation, where is this really holding us back in terms of tackling some of these huge questions? And then I think are we seeing that then with kind of limitations of governments to kind of like respect the democratic wishes of populations that would probably reallocate funds to actually address these issues? And I think some of the historical injustices, and also I think just because we want to save humanity in that regard.
I think that's a great question, but I would say, and then you can pitch in, don't underestimate your own power. I mean, the reason why, if you go back to the Conference of Parties for Climate Change Agreement in Paris, the reason why the United States ended up signing on, which, we were pulled there, dragging and screaming, was because of world outroar and not wanting to be embarrassed, not wanting to be a holdout. We've been holdouts before. We were a holdout with the criminal court. I mean, it's not that we haven't said no, but I think the people power, the world harangue and shout and shame, potential shame label, was such that the United States signed on. And so, I've got that wrong? I see your eyes.
No, I think you've got that right. I mean, we have to temper that a little bit with the fact the Senate doesn't ratify treaties anymore, especially around environmental sets of issues. So I want to be as hopeful as I can, and I do agree with you that I think this new generation has a different view on these approaches, the way they work and the way they think about their own livelihoods. It's really, really interesting and been challenging, but in a good way, right? It's making me rethink my own views on all this stuff. But my problem is that our government leaderships don't turn over rapidly enough. And so I fear that our political systems are not evolving rapidly enough to keep up with some of these types of changes. And we become too intransigent in old thinking because some of our folks are living too long, to be frank, in political terms.
I know what you mean, but guess what? This is another one where before we're talking about youth, I think that changes going around the world are going to force the United States to wake up. Just like, look what has happened to France. Sorry, we don't even have to talk about the US. Look what has happened to France in French-speaking West Africa. Not all of French-speaking Africa, used to have the #1 position, as of, last year. But, and all of a sudden, after country of its formal colonies, has been not only criticized, but roundly kicked out. So they're doing they have to do a whole new assessment. What did we miss? But also, what can be our new relationship? And so I think that youth all around the world, but also the developing countries are going through changes. Part of it is coming from our friends from China and our friends from India and friends from, in certain instances, friends from Brazil that are helping create opportunities that the United States and the West sort of had too many conditions about. But we're seeing change now. It's not all positive necessarily, but it's evolving, it's evolutionary. And so it can go from one stage to another, and the United States is going to have to learn how to respond to that.
Yes.
Now that's a hand.
Yeah, Dr. Owusu, you can respond while we have another question, but go ahead and contribute, please.
So my contribution is that is the goodwill. America, for instance, has a goodwill in Ghana, and when you pitch it as if by trying to do something, it's always an opportunity cost that the local American population will have to bear. Then it will be difficult for people to want to even venture and try to sacrifice. But there are things in the past that have worked, and I don't think has cost the U.S. that much. Something like the African Growth and Opportunity Act that allows some goods that were not being allowed into the U.S. at all to come in. And people work hard on the continent and they produce, and the production comes in. But if the West is going to take a position that an established industry like cocoa that has served Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and many countries well, and begin to do campaigns and say, oh, the cocoa is being produced by child labor, and so on and so on. That's the narrative you get in some of the established Western media. And then if China is ready to buy the cocoa, then what do you think will happen? So I think that Africa is not looking necessarily for a Marshall Plan, but an opening up of opportunity which people could harness. Because I don't think that the French-speaking countries' first option was to kick France out of West Africa. But after knocking at the door, wanting things to change, and things were not changing, because if you didn't play ball with France at the time, there was nowhere to go. But now, if they kick France out, there's somewhere else to go. So as the ambassador said, maybe happenings around the world will also then bring US and the West in general to the table in a different dimension. But I think there is an opportunity for helping out Africa that could benefit both Africa and the West as well.
Thank you. That was great. So we'll take the two questions. I don't think there's any more questions, and then I would hand things back to I'll hand things to Dr. Rovine to kind of summarize the conversations and close us out for today, because we have 10 more minutes left. And Dr. Owusu, please hold on after, because we're going to also take a selfie.
So my question is actually related to something that you just talked about. So there's also day-to-day risks that people face in addition to climate risks that may be affecting them now or later, and these are to do with extreme poverty and being able to deal with, life events. And these are exacerbated by people's dependence on a lot of big multinational corporations and industries who they're dependent on to get their incomes. And a lot of these industries and corporations are able to propagate this inequality in how the profits are distributed from their activities. And that's going to keep adding up, and that's going to reduce the capabilities of households or people to deal with later climate risks.
Mhm.
How does international law or diplomacy kind of address that?
Ambassador Williams, sorry, can we take her question and then you can all respond? Go ahead.
First of all, I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity. It's been very interesting conversation. But my question is kind of referencing what a couple of points that each of you addressed. The first one being how diplomats have to manage the process so parties can own their own answer, so the whole process can be sustainable. And also Dr. Owusu talking about how in the West we have some ideas that some people hold that can be damaging to the whole process as well. So my question is, what are some of the dangers that this in the West we oftentimes are like feel that we need to be saviors sometimes, and even though in our own domestic issues like in Flint, Michigan with water, there we can't even solve those issues. So what are some dangers that come with not solving our problems here and then extending this kind of a mentality that we need to be working on things abroad without also dealing with what we're doing, the issues we've created here as well.
So the word that you asked, disingenuity, was it disingenuous? No, it's hypocritical. Okay. So it's Flint, Michigan, and water. It's not that we can't deal with the water problem in Flint, Michigan. We didn't. They knew what the problem was. They didn't change the pipes. They knew the water was bad. So they said, well, we're not going to have that water come into our city. We're only going to let it go into Flint. Didn't go into Detroit. Didn't go to Ann Arbor. So that's different. That's a choice. That's a political choice that has to do with that whole morality thing we were talking about before. So we're actually not, but I don't remember what was the first part of your question. I think that might have been for Dr. Owusu, but I'm going to go to yours from what I understood and then everybody else. So I actually think that you weren't asking an environmental question, but you were more asking like an economic / political question. So let's take, and I know that, I don't know if it was a real court case or like they just settled out of court or whatever, but let's just use Monsanto. All right, made seeds. For a company, a multinational company to come in and set up a plant and do whatever it's doing and have that have a negative effect on the locals. That is an issue that has to deal with, well, what are the regulations in that country? So did that happen because they weren't following the law, or did that happen because they were following the laws and they're so loose because they're trying to attract investment that they work against the welfare of the community? Did that happen because there was corruption and somebody was paid not to pay attention? So there's that aspect. Like part of that is really first the responsibility of the nation. What's the rule of law framework? But let's say there's a disaster, there's an oil leak or somewhere. And so then what is the American embassy, what's your American government going to do when it's the American company that has created this issue? We can then say, well, you know what? If you were doing the same business in the United States, would you be allowed to do it? And if we find that, let's say the answer is no, you wouldn't have been allowed to use child labor, you wouldn't have been allowed to just pollute the lake that you feed your byproducts into or whatever. But in this country, it was legal. We try to use the shame factor. And we can do that by directly dealing with the local business or contacting their headquarters and saying, look, this is creating a bad image for the country, which is going to end up being politically sensitive to us as a government, but also to all your employees and to that stuff like that. So that's how, in a diplomatic level, we would do that. Now, there are certain international laws that can then be applied, like damages and things like that. If you were producing something that it could be proved, which often is hard, but possible, that you've caused, let's say you're causing generationally passed down deformities. Those kinds of things, yes, can be documented, proved, and taken to an international court.
Thank you. You want to
Maybe just quickly, because I may be able to link those two issues. Because you made a point that's kind of interesting, which is, look, the water problem might not be a water problem at all. And resiliency might not be addressing climate challenges at all. And that's an important message for us to think about. I've often argued that addressing land tenure is probably the single best thing we could do to expand access to safe drinking water and sanitation. Because if people own the land that they live on, they will often invest in their own improving their own life, because they can recover those costs. There's a good, strong. One of the reasons why the U.S. government doesn't do a lot of land tenure work anymore, we got out of it, in part because we run into systemic inequalities that these countries are. We'd have to run up against these policies, and they want to protect those types of inequalities. And we want to try to break down those inequalities by creating. So these things start to run up against each other. And again, we have to be very humble and self-aware as we walk into these processes so that we can do this in the right way. But in some cases, that means not addressing the systemic challenges that we need to address to solve these problems. And instead, we go out and we drill lots of wells all over the planet, but we don't address the fundamental underlying issue that's preventing those things from being sustainable in the first place. And 5 years later, most of them don't work. And we've been interested, and then we look back and we say, how come we haven't made any progress in the last 50 years? We're doing the same things over and over again, and we're not addressing the systemic issues, in part because I think we fear them. We fear them ourselves. And I think that we're also not, I don't think we have the core capabilities to go in and even have those conversations with some of these countries, because we are not in that right. We haven't done our own introspection around these sets of issues in a way that allows us to be a credible and legitimate. That's a real challenge.
Thank you. Dr. Owusu, any final words?
Yeah, just an addition. I think that it's not as difficult as we are making it seem, because I don't think America can go out there and just create a first world out of a developing country. It's not going to happen. The blueprints are there. So the countries that have, where the Koreans, where American was, the Japans, Germany, and the rest, is by ensuring good governance. So if you ensure good governance, and we create leadership in our own country that are working for the people, then we can develop our country. But I don't think that any goodwill from the US or China or any developed country can pick another country and make it into themselves, unless the leadership are supported, if they are good leaders. But if it is for US national interests and we have oppressive leadership in our countries, and you pump how much money into that country, it will not trickle down to the people. So good governance, which most of the time US foreign policy is looking at and supporting democracy and making it work. And we should all know that democracy does not always equal to good governance. It's the goodwill to wanting to help your people. And some of the leaders in these developing countries are not cut to be doing that. And that is the major crash. So I think that if we have the goodwill and we are dialoguing to get results, the blueprints are there. But to go in and build infrastructure and do all sort of things, I don't think will really be the way to solve the problem. But if people are accountable to their country, then they will do good, and then the people will enjoy. Thank you.
A really important point.
We couldn't, that's the best answer.
That's an excellent point.
That's a good way to conclude this panel conversation. And I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Vicky Rovine, who's the director of the African Studies Center.
Thank you so much, everybody. I want to start by thanking the panelists, Dr. Salzberg, Ambassador Williams, and Dr. Owusu, who I want to especially thank because I don't know if you're aware, it's quite a bit later in Ghana than it is here. So we really appreciate his contribution. And we look forward to meeting him in Ghana.
Okay.
I also want to thank Ada Umenwaliri, the Associate Director of the African Studies Center, who did an amazing job. Her questions were great. The poll at the beginning was wonderful. We're going to be publishing the results of that poll. I'm kidding. No, we won't. I also want to thank Laura Cox. I want to thank Baholomande Yapo, who's not here. Laura is our graduate assistant in the center, and Baholomande is our undergraduate assistant, and the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Affairs, Sharmila and Heather and Emmy, and the work study students who are waiting for pizza, I think. So I want to thank all of you. I'm going to be very brief. I know we're pretty much out of time. Plus, I'm an art historian. So I'm the last person that you want responding to a panel of scientists and social scientists and diplomats. But I'm going to just mention, because time is short, 3 takeaways, 3 quotes from each of our panelists that give me hope. There's a lot of information that we've been hearing this evening that is not hopeful. But on the other hand, each one of our panelists said something that I wrote down thinking, keep that in mind. Dr. Salzberg said at the beginning of his first response to Ada's question, cooperation is more common than conflict. I think we don't hear about the global water issues that never do explode into conflict or don't become sources of tension. So that gives me heart. Dr. Owusu, you mentioned in your response to your second question that farmers know what works best for them, which makes me wonder about the possibility of scaling up some of the things that smallholders do and looking at those kinds of solutions on a state or even an international level. And then Ambassador Williams said, don't underestimate your own power. And I think we can all take that to heart. And then finally, very last thing that I want to quote one of our panelists on, again, Dr. Owusu, who said, it's not as difficult as we're making it seem. So maybe there are some solutions that are sitting there waiting to be taken up, and maybe will help the world look forward to a better future. And I also agree with Ambassador Williams. It's the generation of people who are now undergraduate and graduate students that are going to make that difference. So I want to thank all of you very, very much for coming. We really are pleased to have such a great turnout. And we look forward to seeing you at another upcoming African Studies Center event.
Thank you.